buenas tardes a todos los que nos acompañan hoy. Tenemos hoy una sesión que, como ustedes saben, se va a desarrollar en inglés, The Fading Legacy of Rebel Governance in Uganda, que va a estar a cargo del doctor Nelson Kasfir del Darmouth College, y va a tener como comentarista al doctor Melchiorre de la Universidad de los Andes en Colombia. Nos va a acompañar en la moderación Ricardo Benítez, nuestra compañera y coordinadora de Diálogos ALADAA, Tatiana Helves, se va a incorporar en un breve momento. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Ricardo, la palabra es tuya.
Bien, muchas gracias, Lía, por tus palabras. Este justamente es un evento a realizarse por Diálogos ALADAA en cooperación con el Semillero Estudios Globales y va a ser realizado en inglés. A partir de este momento cambiamos a inglés para dar la introducción y la presentación de los expositores. Greetings and welcome to a new event of Diálogos ALADAA in cooperation with Semillero Estudios Globales. The event of today was titled The Fate and Legacy of Rebel Governance in Uganda. We're glad to count with the presence of Dr. Nelson Kasfir, Emeritus Professor at Dartmouth College in the United States. Nelson Kasfir, he writes about African politics, democracy, parliament, and development, particularly issues involving Uganda and Kenya. He edits and co-authored Civil Society and Democracy in Africa, Critical Perspectives, and co-edited and co-authored Rebel Governance in Civil War. He's working on a book comparing the governance practice of two rebel groups in Uganda, and he's also compiling a worldwide data set on rebel governance. Kasfir recently received a fellowship at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study in South Africa. And also we had the comments of the Dr. Melchiorre, professor of University of Los Andes in Colombia. He's a PhD and Magister in Political Science of the Toronto University, and is assistant professor of the Department of Political Science of the University of the Los Andes in Bogota. His research about even political science in Africa and history. And he has a field work in Eastern Africa during the last 7 years in 3 different countries, including Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. And he has published several articles about political history of student movements and youth politics in Africa. This event will be structured as follows: an introduction of the panelists, the comments and exposition at the last stage of questions to be closed with the final comments. Also, this event will be transmitted by Facebook Live in the page, in the website of Diálogos Internacional, ALADAA Internacional. And if you want to add some comments, please kindly add it in on the comments bar just below the screen of Facebook. We will take account of your question and we add it on the section question. And now we will start with the exposition of Dr. Nelson Kasfir. Dr. Kasfir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, and thank you, Ricardo and Luke, for arranging this event. You've done a great job, and I'm delighted to have the chance to talk through this paper. It's not published, and so from your comments, I'm sure I can make it even better. Let me start by discussing what legacy is. Rebels come into state government with some experience. Most rebels have actually governed civilians while they were fighting the Civil War. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So they have some experience of government, and one might assume that they would like to introduce it into the state. So the legacy question becomes, if rebels become the state or join the state, how much do they change its existing doctrines and institutions by importing their wartime governance structures and doctrines into their new regime? That's the question of legacy. And we will look at how that worked out in Uganda. But to answer that, we obviously are only looking at rebels that enter post-Civil War governments. Many rebels are defeated. probably most rebels are actually defeated by the state governments that they oppose, but some succeed. And when they succeed, they join the government in two different ways. Either they join it outright, perhaps because they win a battle for control of the state, which happened in Uganda, or they join it through a peace settlement, in which case they share the government with some other parties. It should be obvious that if they have a free hand, they have a greater chance to put their legacy into effect if they choose to do it. Some rebels do not wish to do it. Some of them simply wish to take over the existing state, either because they thought they could run it better or because they wanted to loot it, to put it in very stark terms. And there are a lot of positions in between. So our question becomes, if you win, because I'm looking at the winning case, because that's the case of the National Resistance Army that won in Uganda in 1986. What did they do? What did they do at takeover? How much did they introduce what they had done before when they were fighting the Civil War? And for how long did they do it? So in order to look at legacy, we have to look at rebel governance to know what it is that they might have done in order to estimate how much they actually did do. So broadly, rebel governance refers to how rebels organize civilians for a public purpose other than fighting in the territories they controlled during Civil War. That's what I mean by rebel governance. How did they organize them? And we need to add to that, what doctrines did they promise to adopt when they came to power? Because that would be part of their legacy as well. So I already said, and I'll repeat, almost all rebels form governments, but they do it very differently. So we need to look at some of the details about how they organize governments. And I would suggest that one fairly simple way of talking about that is to ask whether the rebel governance involved civilian participation. Some do, some don't. Did it involve civilian administration? Some do, some don't. And did it involve commercial production? Did they organize the civilians in order to make a lot of money from their activities? So there's an enormous variation. Just consider for a moment the difference between Marxists and warlords, and you can imagine the enormous variation there is. And you could, since many of you come from Colombia, and many other Latin Americanists know about the FARC and the ELN, and you can consider how differently they approach the question of governance. The ELN had a FOCO theory for the first half of their life, and in it, they didn't see the necessity of organizing civilians. So that's quite different from the FARC, which organized civilians from the very beginning. So we can, both groups are Marxist, but they're Marxist in different ways. I'm not going to discuss the FARC and the ELN. Other people are far more expert in that than I am, but I would say that that's will give many of you some idea of what the differences are. So we should expect the legacies to differ because rebel governance differs so much. Now, tracing the legacy has another use. It's one way of examining the history of states after rebels take power. It's a way of, when you ask the question, how much of their legacy did they import, you're thrown into the necessity of saying, well, what happened? And how much of the existing state did they continue to put in effect? And how much did they change it? So that becomes our question, and that's what I will go through with you this afternoon. So I'm applying these notions to a specific case. The NRM, that stands for National Resistance Movement, and you'll excuse me for using letters. I forget to spell it out each time I give it, in Uganda. And I think most of you know, but let me just mention for those who may not exactly know where Uganda is, it's a small country in East Africa, inland, has no opening to the sea. I often say in the United States it's the size of Oregon, but that may not be a very useful thing to say to this audience. And I can't say which country, maybe Ecuador is perhaps the same size as Uganda. I should look that up but I didn't do it before this talk. Now there's a particular puzzle, and that puzzle is that the NRM took over a failed state with the promise to restore good government. But you know already from the title of this talk that the legacy faded, or at least I think the legacy faded, and I hope to convince you that that's the case. So the question becomes, why didn't they continue with what were a number of good ideas, which had a terrific amount of enthusiasm among the population? And you will see as I proceed with this talk that they actually did begin that way and then began to change their minds. And we need to ask, why did they change their minds in order to understand what happened to their legacy? And if we just look at the 2021 election, the election in Uganda that was just concluded, we would say that there is almost no legacy left in the government of Uganda. Maybe some formal institutions, but the spirit with which they came out of the bush in order to take over the government, that's gone. So we have some really important questions. The abduction of Bobi Wine, who opposed Museveni for the presidential election in this past January. Many of his workers were abducted, some were tortured, several were killed, as well as many people attending his rallies who were killed. Something happened to that legacy, and that's the question that we want to look at today. That's the puzzle I'm trying to resolve. Now, let me begin by saying that Uganda had a checkered history long before Museveni came to power. And in fact, it could be fairly said that it became a failed state before when Museveni took power. So let me ask the question now and then try to answer it. Why did Uganda become a failed state? And the short answer runs like this. First of all, Uganda was not a state in any way, shape, or form until the British made it one. And the British, by the way, had a misnomer when they called it Uganda. They were thinking of only one constituent unit in Uganda, that's Buganda, a kingdom within Uganda, has only 1/6 the population, 1/4 the size of the country. The British put together a disparate group of cultural units which had some trade relations, had some history of cooperating and a history of war, and tried to turn them into a state. So we begin there. And what happened was during the colonial and independence period, there was a lot of competition from people within these small cultural units in terms of cleavages, which didn't get resolved during the British colonial period and still didn't get resolved during the independence period, at least weren't resolved up to the time Museveni took over. These cleavages, and I'll just list them for you because they continue to reverberate even during the Museveni period, were ethnic cleavages, regional cleavages, religious cleavages, gender cleavages, and economic rivalries. All of these things made Uganda extremely complicated to govern. The largest of these was Buganda Kingdom, which I mentioned a minute ago, which was larger than any other entity. And all the other entities were worried that Buganda would take over. So that became a zero-sum problem, which has still to this day is not resolved. And just to mention a current development, which makes it even harder to resolve, Bobby Wine, running against Museveni, got far more votes than Museveni did in Buganda. And that only pushes the problem forward. And we'll wait and see what Museveni does as a result of that. But that was always a problem in the colonial period and in the independence period up to the time Museveni took over. And as I just said, continuing. Southerners were always richer than Northerners for a variety of reasons. We don't have much time, any time to go into that, but let's just notice that they had more schools and that meant more educated people, and that meant more jobs going and more wealth flowing to the South over time. They had more clinics, to health and hospitals, and they simply had more wealth than people in the North. And so that exacerbated the cleavages with which they entered into the British colonial regime. However, that advantage of Southerners was balanced by the fact that the Northerners dominated national government after independence. Obote came from the North, and many of his votes were Northern. And then, of course, Idi Amin came from another part of the North, no friend of Obote's, but from the North. And then Obote succeeded after Amin was overthrown. There was an interim period in between, but Obote then had 5 more years, and then he was overthrown by a coup from within his own army. And it was that army that controlled Uganda for the last 6 months of the period before Museveni's forces, the NRM, won the war. And in fact, those northern coup makers invited warring militia to Kampala. Uganda became a state with those militias, which didn't cooperate with each other. They simply were on the same side. It became a state without a central authority. This is now, we're speaking 1985 into the beginning of 1986. And that's why it was a failed state. It had factions that controlled different areas, but there was no central authority. That was the situation the NRM faced when it took power. Now, Museveni had organized his rebellion in 1981, and he eventually defeated the state army in early 1986, only 5 years. Compare that to the FARC and the ELN, which both were formed in the middle 1960s and continue in some way, shape, or form today, though it's very confusing, at least to an outsider like me, whether they're still rebels or whether they're bound by a peace settlement, and it will stay that way. So, but the point is that neither of them took state power, so we can't speak about whether their legacy will end up being part of Colombia's government. Maybe that will happen, but it certainly isn't on the cards today. So we now need to ask the next question, which is, what sort of rebel governance did the NRA create during the Civil War? And the first point to make is that the NRA fought a classic guerrilla war, rural areas mainly, but very close to Kampala, and without much foreign assistance because, as I already mentioned, Uganda is landlocked, and they were fighting within Uganda in a way that they were not close to any border of Uganda where they could somehow get sanctuary or get arms or material help from another country. So they fought without much foreign help, and they fought only in Buganda until the last year of the war, when they opened up a second front in the western part of the country. So their rebel governance was limited. and to understand that, I want to look at the three clusters I mentioned before as one way to measure what rebel governance occurred. They did do some civilian participation. It was their greatest triumph by introducing village democracy. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they did very little civilian administration, some, but not very much. And they did almost no commercial production. There was simply nothing for them to produce. And they were focused on fighting the Ugandan army. They didn't have time or control of territory in a way in which they could do that. So what did they do? Well, first of all, they abolished the chiefs. The chiefs had all been appointed by Obote, and they were really party hacks. So the NRM abolished them and chased them out and killed some of them. The NRM has a reputation for treating its enemies humanely, and that's true in the large part, but there are many exceptions to that. They abolished taxation. Ordinarily, if you want to create a civilian administration, you tax the people because you have to have officials collecting, and many theories have been built about how states got formed by through taxation, and the result of taxation means you have tax collectors. The tax collectors have to be supervised. There's a hierarchy, and all of a sudden you have a state apparatus. This was true in many states in formation in medieval and early modern Europe. It was not true for the NRM during its rebel governance phase. So there was almost no civilian administration until the last 3 months of the war, last 3 months of their 5-year war, when they formed an interim administration, which had a kind of bureaucratic form to it. So it wasn't really very important for most of the war. But the fact of their greatest achievement was this village democracy, which I just mentioned, in which they elected what they called resistance committees. And I may slip into saying RC for resistance committees. These were committees elected by villages. And the important point to understand is no village had ever done that before. This was a completely new idea. And the NRM did not go into the war intending to do this. It decided during the war that this was a good idea. They certainly set up committees from the beginning of the war in order to have villagers supply them with food. And in Uganda, most of the people hated Obote. They were Southern. They hated Northerners. I don't overestimate. Almost everybody uniformly disliked the fact that Northerners were dominating them for so many years. But as a result, they were happy to help the NRM because they thought the NRM is fighting for them. So they started out with supply committees, and a year in, they said, let's let the people elect their own representatives. I won't go into the details. I don't have time. Happy to do so more if you want to ask me during the question period. But it turned out these village elections, and in some cases, they elected up to a second level, the parish, and in 1 or 2 cases to the third level, the sub-county. So they were involved in elections, and they were known for that. And there was a lot of enthusiasm among Ugandans who supported them, even in the towns, because they had done that. It seemed as if they were going to bring democracy back to Uganda. But much of the thrust of rebel governance came from doctrine, which they also had. And doctrine is very much part of rebel governance, partly what they do and partly the promise of what they're going to do. And that's an issue which we can discuss more in the discussion, to what degree we should include their promises for the future as part of their legacy. But for me, I think it's important a part of it. They also had a disciplined army, And they spent a lot of time and effort ensuring that their army was disciplined. And that was exactly the opposite of Amin's army, which was totally undisciplined, and Obote's army too. And certainly in that last period after Obote was overthrown, there was no control over soldiers. So that what Ugandans really wanted was an army that didn't go around attacking civilians. And the NRM promised that kind of army. So that basically would be what I would say was the doctrine and the rebel governance. No commercial production, not much civilian administration, and a big achievement in civilian participation through these village committees. And of course, in the doctrine, they promised that they would return to democracy for the whole country after they took power again, and they promised a new constitution. All of this was involved in as part of their doctrine when they marched into Kampala in the January 1986. So what happened after the NRA takeover? So here's the puzzle again. Prospects seem good for putting their program into effect, and yet the legacy mostly faded. Why did that happen? At first, the NRA leadership was committed to what they had accomplished. They knew that the doctrine and practices increased their legitimacy. So even if you argue that they didn't believe it, you can still say that they should be committed to it because it increased their legitimacy and therefore made them more secure. Now, I would argue that many of them did believe it at the time, but it's very hard to understand what the state of mind is of people as they march into an unfamiliar situation and have to take over a government. And they defeated the state army. But we can still ask, did that actually mean they had a free hand? And I will shortly argue it didn't mean that. It meant they had somewhat of a free hand, but not as much as many observers thought. So why did they change their minds? Here are a lot of possible explanations, and then I'll go into the one that I favor. They had been deprived of creature comforts during the war. Their uniforms were a mess. They had rarely had enough food. They just weren't well supplied because all the supplies they could get were supplies they took from the enemies or from the voluntary contributions of very poor peasants. So that's one possible explanation. They were deprived of creature comforts, and therefore the legacy faded because they wanted creature comforts. I don't think this is the correct answer or a very large part of what happened, but it's a theory, and you can think about that too. Secondly, they may have believed that since they succeeded in removing an old and hated government, they had the right to rule. And a number of them believed that, and that may have caused them to say, and one can argue that many of them would say that even now, they have the right to rule because they won the war. Again, I don't think that's the whole answer. It's a bit of the answer, perhaps, but we should keep that in mind as an alternative. And thirdly, you could argue, and this I think is a stronger theory, and I would subscribe to it in part. At first, they were threatened after they took over, and I'll explain how in just a moment. But when they were secure, maybe they were no longer motivated to follow rebel governance. They saw, you could argue, I don't, but you could argue they saw rebel governance as a way to get into power. And once they were secure in power, they were no longer motivated to follow it. That certainly describes a fading legacy, but I think it's only a piece of the answer. Now, the other point to make is that what happened to the legacy did not happen all at once. It's a complicated story going back and forth, and so we need to follow it over time. And I'm not going to give a chronological account, but you will see that some things happened early, which substantiated the legacy, and then it began to fade. So why did the legacy fade? It faded slowly over time, and essentially, and I will end by repeating this, because they chose power over their promises. And I'm going to argue there are 4 reasons why it failed. They were insecure at first. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is they really were afraid of democracy, afraid they would lose if there was actual democracy. 3, they developed a system of clientelism, which secured them in power. And 4, there was the emergence of personal rule. Of course, the person who had the personal rule was Museveni himself. A big surprise. And I want to go through those 4 reasons. I would say the 4 together suggest how the legacy faded, but understand fade doesn't mean removal. Some things have persisted to today, but it's a pale shadow of what it was in 1986. So the first reason was insecurity, as I said. The victory was not decisive militarily and not decisive politically. And the NRM consistently chose security over democracy. So let's look at that. Now, if you look at where the NRM fought, when I say NRA, it's just the army of the NRM, National Resistance Army. But I try to say NRM to avoid confusion. The NRM originally had military control only over rural areas in 2 regions, the Buganda region and the West, where they opened the Second Front, when they came to power. So there were 2 other regions and a lot of areas in the regions that where they were fighting, where they had no control and no idea whether they would have support from those areas. So over the next 20 years, the NRA actually fought 16 regional rebellions. 8 of them popped up in 1988. The first one occurred in their first year when the state army, which they chased out of Uganda into Sudan to the north, came back into the country and tried to fight its way to Kampala. All of these rebellions were either defeated or resulted in peace settlements. So the NRA remained in power, but you couldn't say they were secure. And there were consequences. The first consequence is the obvious one. When you're fighting rebellions, you expand your army and you spend your budget on that army. So there was a military tilt to what the government was doing. Imagine 16 rebellions, and if you ignore them, they'll end up marching on Kampala. This includes the famous one that everybody knows about, the Lord's Resistance Army, which lasted the longest, but it wasn't the only one. And in many ways, while they couldn't defeat it, it wasn't the one that threatened them the most. But the only point I'm making here is they had to respond to these rebellions, and that cost them, that tilted them into more military affairs. And among other things, what happened was that the military were more formally integrated into the government through a number of arrangements, which might not have happened if they hadn't been fighting those wars. Now, in fact, the army remained disciplined, but it was the instrument of the government. And as the government became less and less concerned about its legacy, the army began to be turned on the civilians in ways that resulted in the 2021 election I mentioned, in which the army and the police were attacking civilians, and especially opponents of Museveni, who won the election against Bobi Wine. The new government's political control was also questionable. Its popular support was strongest in the towns of the South, where it fought, and in the rural areas where it actually, where it conducted its battles. There were old line parties in Uganda, which had been formed in the 1950s. I'll give you their initials just for purposes of illustration: the UPC, Uganda People's Congress, and the DP, the Democratic Party. And no one knew what their mobilization capacity was after Museveni took power. So he was threatened because, after all, they were new. And even though he had run for president in 1980 and did very poorly, it wasn't clear whether he could stand up and do an election by himself. So there was an insecurity politically as well as militarily. The old line parties felt threatened. One party tilted toward Protestantism, the other party tilted toward Catholicism. And there's much argument about how Catholic one was, how Protestant the other one was, but that old religious cleavage was certainly there. And Museveni had come out against sectarianism. One of the doctrines, which I didn't mention before, was we are anti-sectarian, which meant anti-ethnic, anti-religious, and anti-regional regions. Museveni's idea was we will transcend the cleavages which had caused Uganda to fail in the past. And this was an enormously popular doctrine at the time he took power, and for several years after that. So the parties were threatened, and they attempted to fight back as best they could, but they were constantly facing a government which was trying to prevent them from being very active, as we'll see in just a moment. But the main point is the NRM did not know, because it hadn't been involved in campaigning, whether winning the war would mean they'd win an election too. And that, for that reason, they manipulated a number of the political processes, particularly election processes. So at first, it simply appointed its members, people they called the historicals. Historical simply means you were with the NRM during the war, and that became the national legislature. The NRC, the National Resistance Council, appointed entirely from Museveni's fighters and civilians supporting him from the war, became the legislature immediately after he won, which was one way to avoid any competition from the other parties. Now, as a new government, the NRM did pursue its legacy. In the first place, it extended the RCs to every village in the country. In other words, it took what worked in the war and expanded it to the whole country. So that suggests, at least in that action, they were following their legacy. And that happened in the first year of the war. And they had a second policy which very much followed their legacy. And in fact, you can find it mentioned in NRM documents written during the war. And that was called the broad-based policy, which is we need to be inclusive and involve everyone in the government. So they gave the top cabinet posts, except defense, which the Museveni as president kept for himself, to opponents in other parties. That didn't mean that they had the power to do very much, but they were symbolically involved in the government, and it too was enormously popular because no one had ever done that before. There had been no unity governments in Uganda before that. Now, however, to protect themselves with the resistance committees, which were extended to all villages, these committees were autonomous during the war, but they were not autonomous after the NRM took power. Instead, the NRM passed a statute in 1987, its second year in power, in which it gave bureaucratic control over the resistance committees to the Minister of Local Government. And he even had the power to dissolve them if they did something he didn't approve of. And it put district administrators who were directly responsible to the president in every district to keep his eye. There were no women appointed at first, though soon after there were women who became district administrators. put the DA in charge of the resistance committees and to oversee their elections. Each resistance committee, after Museveni took power, could elect the council in the village, could elect its own committee, its own governing body. And again, there was broad-based government, but it too had an underside to it. NRM co-opted leaders. It didn't consult. It didn't work to develop a program which actually included the ideas of these people. It simply brought them in, gave them powerful positions. And in fact, it was the beginning of patronage in Uganda, which developed into clientelism a few years later. Okay, that's the first reason why the legacy began to fail soon after the NRM took power. Turning to the second reason, there was a fear of loss of power if they allowed open democracy. Now, I've touched on that already, and now I want to see what exactly they did. Essentially, the government manipulated its rebel governance policies, its rebel governance democracy policies. It manipulated elections, and it manipulated the doctrine. In short, it maintained the forms of these even to today, but hollowed out the substance. Elections were held. Some were free and fair in the actual elections, but the rules were set to make sure the NRM could not lose the elections. For example, there was an election in 1989, the first national election after the NRM took power. And it was done in a way that allowed the NRM to appoint 25% of the delegates. The president had the power to appoint them, and it had very small representation in the parliament. Small representation in the villages. The electorate was very tiny. I can explain that. I won't do it now, but please feel free to ask me in the question period. And in all the elections that followed, for the first 10 years, Museveni did not run an election. He was just president. Eventually, when a new constitution was adopted in 1995, he ran the following year for the first time in an election and did very well. But he also used a lot of state money to elect himself. He didn't scruple at not using state funds, whereas the people who ran against them, who could run and say, I'm a multi-partyist, I will support multi-parties if I get elected. The election was free in the sense they could do that, but they didn't have anywhere near the funds. Anyway, Museveni, who was still quite popular at the time, received 72% of the vote. And his opponent, who was a member of the Democratic Party, the DP, one of the old line parties, received only 28% of the vote. Let's look at changes in doctrine as part of this move away from democracy, the second reason. During the war, the NRM had condemned old parties as sectarian, as I mentioned earlier, but said it would return to multi-party competition. But it didn't. That changed after winning. Instead, it banned the parties for the interim period. So you could run and say, I will introduce multi-parties if I'm elected, but you could not be part of an organized party. The party couldn't meet, the party couldn't campaign, the party couldn't raise funds. It could exist, its headquarters were left for the party, but it couldn't actually act. So the parties were sufficiently hobbled that the NRM felt comfortable in running against them. Now, it ran in the 1990s under a doctrine called no party democracy, which was actually a new doctrine which didn't exist during the rebel period. In other words, it diluted the notion of the legacy that was carried forward. Museveni invented the doctrine by saying that after all, the parties weren't effective during the rebel period, which is true. Right now, we know that there was a lot of cheating under the old system, and we'll just get rid of the whole thing. Everybody will run on their personal merit. You run as an individual. And this was quite popular, except for the fact that there was one organization, the NRM, which had control of the state and was advantaged by this doctrine. And in fact, Museveni said, until there are different economic interests in the country, that is, until we move from a peasant economy to an industrialized economy, we have to have no party democracy because we're all in the same boat. We all have the same interests. Now, there are a lot of difficulties with that. No time to go into those difficulties. All the point I'm asking you to consider is that this doctrine hobbled his opponents and gave the NRM a leg up, but it was not what they promised when they were in the bush fighting the Civil War. They did adopt a new constitution, and that constitution is really a very impressive constitution. There was a lot of consultation before they adopted it. And again, there was election of delegates, no party, but under no party democracy, but delegates got elected. The elections were basically free, basically fair. But as it happened, the NRM had the majority of people in the Constituent Assembly, and the new constitution extended the period of no party system, which meant the NRM would continue to rule, even though there was no rationale why they should be ruling in a no party system. But they were there, and it meant they would rule. So they gave them 5 years, after which Ugandans could have a referendum and choose which system they wanted, a multi-party system or a no-party system. In many other ways, the Constitution set up a lot of ways of checking the president. The Constitution was amended many, many times in the period from 2000 forward, and we'll come back to some of that. Let me turn to the third reason. The government created a clientelistic system, and that weakened institutions and the rule of law. Now, it did it to protect its regime, and it did it for personal profit as well. Again, it's a mixed picture. Let's remember that when he took power, in his first speech, Museveni had called for good governance, by which he meant a non-corrupt government in which each institution was counterbalanced by other institutions and respected them, and the rule of law would be central. And he attacked corruption, and without, to have an effective clientelist system in a country like Uganda, it's going to be based on corruption. You can have clients without corruption, but it was understood that it would work with corruption. We can talk about that more, if you wish, in the question period. Let's also remember that during the Amin Obote years, there was a chaotic economy. The economy declined rapidly under Amin through economic mismanagement. There was high inflation. There was little foreign exchange, and there was a fall in the tax collection, so that the government had very little money. And this meant that the government had valuable resources through their offices and through, as I'll come to in a minute, foreign funds that donors gave them, which allowed it to build a system in which they could reward individuals. So very early, and this is a controversial point, Most people who study Uganda think corruption started late in the 90s. I am arguing that it started very early. In fact, I would say it started with broad-based appointments, but in terms of corruption, even in the late 80s, we see instances of corruption. And I'm suggesting that clientelism really began in the late 80s. And it was entirely against the doctrine that Museveni announced when he took power. They were building political loyalty for material rewards. Now, to give material rewards, you have to collect the money from someplace and then convert it from its intended purpose into paying off people in order to gain political support. But that was the essence of the system. Now, the key to the system was the foreign donors. Oddly enough, the foreign donors are more responsible than anyone else because they were the main source of funds. The IMF bargained with Museveni and the other NRM leaders to turn Uganda into a neoliberal economy. This was entirely the reverse of what Museveni and his leaders wanted to do. Museveni and his leaders issued a manifesto shortly before they took power, which they worked out over several years during the war. It's called the 10-point program. And the framework to that 10-point program and the central point of it was they were going to attack Uganda's dependency on industrialized states in Western Europe. No different than the notion which was very common at the time in Latin America. And in fact, the whole notion of dependency comes originally from writings of people in Latin America, though there's some African writers who also were there at the start. But at any rate, Museveni, and it's very clear if you read the 10-point program, that they saw Uganda as a dependent state, and the idea was to build an independent, self-sustaining economy, though one that would depend both on state and private sectors of the economy. The IMF said, we won't lend you money if that's what you're going to do. So if you want to agree to take our money, then you have to agree to our neoliberal principles and have an economy in which you reduce the size of the government and leave more initiative to the people who are productive, individuals operating through the market. Nothing surprising there. But Uganda had very little money, and the IMF, and on the signal of the IMF, the other donors were prepared to come in, had enormous amounts of money. If you compare the amount of money Uganda could put together for its exchange, the amount the donors were offering was 10 times, 20 times the amount of money. There wasn't any question how Uganda would, how much better off Uganda would be economically if the leaders of the NRM gave up their principles and signed on to a neoliberal structural adjustment program. And that's what they did. And they did it 1 year after they took power. Complete reversal. And they got a lot of money. The United States, for example, gave at the time $500 million and has continued that right up to the present. And I'll come back to the donors at the end of this talk and ask why they haven't gotten very much bang for their buck, why they haven't been able to influence the government. At any rate, neoliberalism gave a lot of money, and the idea was if you shrunk the government, there would be less chance for a clientelist system because there'd be less government to use to attract followers. But in fact, they got around that completely by making sure that the private companies went to friends and members of NRM families. There was privatization, but the privatization ended up in the hands of the NRM. And there was a lot of other money which leaked out to the government. The government allowed people to get wealthy. but it also took a share of it and built its clientelist system on the basis of this money. There are a number of other points to make, but I'm running out of time. And so I want to move on. But at any rate, that's my third reason. I do want to mention one other point, though, because there's an argument in the early 2000s, by 2005, the NRM gave up the no-party system and agreed to multi-party competition. But in return, Museveni, the Constitution had required term limits. Museveni could only serve for 2 terms, even though he had actually served for 10 years before the Constitution. He was given 2 terms under the Constitution, which ended with the election of 2006. So the term limits was, the Constitution was amended, removing term limits. Museveni continued to run. And the NRM became a party. But it wasn't really a party. It's never been a party. It's really been the state disguised as a party. And again, there's much more to say about that, and I will have to put it at that for now. I promised I would talk for no more than an hour. That gives me only 8 minutes to finish the talk. I think I can make it. The fourth reason now is that Museveni developed personal rule, and the way he did it was to eliminate institutional accountability. He rose to the point where when he insisted that something be done, the institution had to give way to him. He became a one-person ruler. And that, of course, reversed the wartime norms. Museveni said the real problem is that Obote and Amin were personal rulers. And now, all of a sudden, he was becoming one. But there's no question that he did that. And this is an enormous surprise. He claims to be the only person with a vision for Uganda's future. There are various theories about this. There's a very interesting one put forward that basically people who profess to be Democrats, faced with a situation of insecurity, will take a step which is technically illegal and see whether they get away with it. When they get away with it, they take another step and a third step and a fourth step. In other words, this doesn't happen all at once, and it isn't necessarily in the mind of the beholder when he starts out to do this. And I think that's a good description of what Museveni did. He found out that he could get away with these things and no one would effectively challenge him. Yes, there was a lot of discussion of what he was doing, but he was able to impose his will and turned into a dictator. So he ended up taking personal control over the Ugandan clientelist system, eclipsing even his close allies, who became distant subordinates. It is a one-person rule in rulership in the country. And so if you ask, why did these people, that Bobby Wine's followers who were killed, tortured, abducted, put in prison, it had to be that Museveni gave permission for that to happen. And people didn't oppose it because that was a quick way to go to prison yourself, or at least to lose your job. The NRM as a party is a projection of personal power. And what that means is it's very unlikely to survive past the life or the presidency of Museveni himself. Still, I have to say the legacy is there in the forms of government. Those remain. People get elected to parliament. Judges are appointed. Sometimes the judges come up with decisions that are not favorable to the government, but never important ones. The judges would never rule in the recent years that the election should be overturned because it was fraudulently handled. Bobby Wine claims he won the election. We can't possibly know that. There is too much fooling around with the ballots to really know who won the election. It's fairly clear that Museveni has some popularity. After all, a person who can dole out sacks of cash, as part of his clientelist system is going to be somewhat popular. And some people see him as a person who saved them from Obote and didn't go back to the Amin regime. Uganda is not like Amin, and the soldiers are not like the soldiers were under Obote and under Amin. They may attack civilians, but they are disciplined in the sense that they follow the orders that they're given. They don't attack on their own. They don't shake people down for their own profit or rob people for their own reasons. So there is some of the legacy left. Let me turn to the conclusion. When they took power, I think officers and soldiers valued the NRM legacy. Some still do, but the ones that still do have been forced out of government and they are powerless. They can complain, they can be the conscience of what the rebel legacy should have been, but they don't hold any power to do anything about it. This legacy included, I'm now summarizing, democratic resistance councils. It included the military code, which disciplined soldiers, and the political and economic doctrines promising constitutional government, electoral democracy, opposition to politicized ethnicity, politicized religion and politics, and national economic independence rather than dependency. All those things were part of the legacy. The legacy faded because, one, the NRM chose to enlarge the army and bring its officers formally into government. Two, to stay in power, it manipulated democratic rules and used intimidation and bribery. Three, the NRM relied on clientelism to protect against parliament, courts, and the other institutions. And four, Museveni increased the role of ethnicity in politics, violating its promise. That's part of three. And Museveni finally became a personal ruler, freeing himself from institutional accountability, able to make any decisions he wants and protect himself against the threat of removal from office. He has returned, therefore, to Uganda's political tradition, if I can say so in quotation marks, of one-man rule, post-independence one-man rule. Finally, what about the foreign donors? If they give money that Uganda absolutely depends on, why don't they have more influence? Why haven't their monetary contributions given them the leverage to achieve some reforms? The donors have never been able to influence Museveni toward good governance. They talk that way, but they don't succeed. Why? Well, first of all, they need to justify their aid budgets by spending them. If you're in the field and you don't spend your foreign aid budget, you're likely to get a smaller one, and that's bad for your agency back home. So there's an impetus to spend despite unfavorable actions by the government. Secondly, and probably more important, many of these countries, United States in particular, but also Britain, rely on Ugandan troops to solve issues of terrorism. Western European and United States governments are terribly worried that if you breed terrorists in Africa, they will come and attack the United States, as the 9/11 incident is thought to resemble. And the way to stop that is to root them out in Africa. And instead of sending American troops, which might result in American deaths, wouldn't be very popular in the United States, they would prefer to pay Ugandans to go. So in order to keep Ugandans in Somalia, where there is the largest force in Somalia of foreign troops is Ugandan, they're willing to overlook, in fact, the depredations of Museveni. So he ignores their calls for reform and he still gets their funding. And he uses it for his clientelist network and other schemes. The lesson, the final lesson of this talk, the NRM rebel governance has faded, though it has not entirely disappeared. At first, due to the NRM's insecurity after taking power, and later because its officials who took over government chose power over promise. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kasfir. That was a wonderful talk and a truly fascinating paper. I think now what we'll do is I have a couple of questions for you, and perhaps we should go one by one, and then we'll open up a kind of a question period for the audience who's watching at home. I wanted to start, if I can, by probing this idea of legacy. I mean, you acknowledge in your paper that the NRA did not enter the Bush War with a clear economic and political doctrine, and that instead they took what you describe as a pragmatic problem-solving approach to rebel governance. In comparison to other African liberation movements like Frelimo in Mozambique, you suggest that the NRA was more reformist than radical, and that their purported commitment to democracy, transparency, and accountability was always cloaked by, you put it as considerable ambiguity. So while it's clear from your work that the NRM and government betrayed some of the initial promises and ideological commitments to the rule of law and people's democracy, does this necessarily represent a fading of their legacy? Or rather, does their more enduring legacy consist of other aspects of the rebel governance, which you highlight in your paper? So, for example, the way the high command of the NRA controlled the decisions of the National Resistance Councils from early on, or their lack of explicit ideological commitments were reflected in their pragmatic approach to economic policy making, or the little attention the NRA paid to organizing civilian administration during its rebellion, which was kind of reflected in their failure to create a cadre of civil servants to replace outgoing UPC officials. In other words, couldn't it instead be argued that it was the very shallowness of the NRA's commitments to these purported ideals and practice and their inherent pragmatism, which represents the true legacy of the rebel governance, not its decline?
Thank you for that question. First of all, you characterize my paper correctly. I have no disagreement about what you say about it, but we can, what we're arguing about here, what you're suggesting, is a different definition of legacy. We can think of the difference between doctrine plus what they actually did with civilians, or we can think about behavior. You are arguing for a behavioral definition of legacy. I am arguing for a doctrine plus actual practices. And it's conceivable. I think there are many pitfalls in taking the approach that you put forward, that is establishing exactly how pragmatic were they at one point or another. There were a surprising number of ways in which they did things which they didn't have to do. I'm going to give you one example just to suggest that pragmatism wasn't the only thing they did. At one point, most of the time they defeated Obote's attempts to attack them, but a final push occurred when when Obote threw 3/4 of his army into the battle, and the NRM, which was always way outnumbered and had far fewer weapons than the Obote government, was forced to flee the area. And what did they do with civilians? The obvious thing to do was to flee to protect the army so they could fight another day. But they didn't just do that. They organized an exodus of the civilians and guarded them, set up routes, actually even set up a committee. You could even argue that was a bit of civilian administration, this committee, to scout out the area where they would go. And they went to the north, not far away, but and told the civilians, if you wish, go and find relatives and stay with them. You'll have to cross enemy lines, but maybe you can do it, or we will take you with us to another area. And they led between 100,000 and 200,000 people out of the area, and it was at great risk to them. So that wasn't pragmatic. that was a belief in the doctrine that they had put forward. Now, it's interesting in this particular case, and you can, even Museveni will admit this, he was against it. And this is one of the few times in the war where he was overruled by other officials, senior officials in his government. Now, I'm perfectly happy to see you take the pragmatic view and look at a paper. A behavioral approach to legacy strikes me as a reasonable way to go, but I think it's actually much harder because it's harder to pin down. It's easier to say, what did they say they were believing in, and what did they actually do that we can actually trace that? I've taken that as the legacy. So 2 points of view. That's my reason for taking mine.
Thank you so much. My second question relates closely to the classes that I've been teaching this semester. So we spent a lot of time.
I hope your students are taking notes now.
Yeah, exactly. This is their cue. We spent a lot of time discussing this semester the role of international financial institutions in the Global South, particularly in the era of structural adjustment programs. Obviously, within this context, Uganda represents an important case study, both because Museveni emerges from this period as a donor darling, and Uganda is often pointed to in the late 80s and early 1990s as a kind of success story of structural adjustment. Now, in your article, you draw a clear link between the IFI promoted privatizations on the one hand and the rise of clientelism in Museveni's Uganda on the other. In fact, you go as far as to suggest that the agreement between the Museveni regime and the IMF was responsible for another important reversal, as you put it, of the NRM's legacy, in that it led to them to abandon their anti-IMF, anti-devaluation, and anti-wholesale laissez-faire economic approach. Can you describe what inspired the NRM to make this U-turn to begin with? And can you explain the relationship between the growing influence of the IMF in Uganda during this period on the one hand, and the rise of clientelism within Museveni's regime on the other?
Yeah, well, I do think I set it up in the paper, but I didn't go into much detail, as much detail as you're asking now. And even now, I'll try to answer briefly rather than go into a long thing. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the situation, the economic situation in Uganda was terrible when Museveni took power. And in fact, there was an enormous amount of corruption already because the government, the inflation had meant there was inflation, but no civil servant had their salary increased. So the only way in which a civil servant kept his job, the only reason why a civil servant kept his job is the government gave them a house. And behind that house, the civil servant planted a garden. And the sales of food from that garden were as important as the small salary. Plus, the civil servant, if he or she had access to goods they could sell, they would sell the goods in their office. In other words, there was a lot of corruption. Then on top of that, the NRM made some very bad decisions, economic decisions in their first year, and they just made the situation worse. Inflation skyrocketed because the government took a state-oriented policy without the wherewithal to make it work. They didn't have a reliable bureaucracy, and yet they were insisting that the state would manage things, and they pegged their economy, they pegged their currency rather than let it float free in the market as the IMF was asking. And so they made a bad situation worse, which made them much more vulnerable. And so they turned around and accepted a rescue. The amount of money was enormous. The temptations were enormous, even if you assumed that people were being honest about it. And a number of NRM officials expected Uganda to take the money and build a more conscientious civil service and achieve development, which would make the NRM more attractive to Ugandans. And that was worth giving up the policy that they came from the bush. I'm not sure I'm fully answering the question you want me to, but that in short was what happened. And if you just look at the amounts of money compared to what tax revenues they could raise, the difference seems incredibly obvious of what they should do. Many of them, I'm sure, went into it without intending to build a clientelist system, but they had the money. And here they said, well, we fought the war and we suffered. Now we'll take some of that money for ourselves and give a lot more to for the people. It'll be good for them and good for me. It was good for me. It wasn't so good for them.
Oh, okay, thanks so much. So just a reminder to the audience, if they do have any questions, they can put it in the comment section and I'll ask them later. My third question is, I want to now kind of turn to focus on the present moment, and I guess this connects more to my own research. Your paper provides a rich historical account of the contradictions that existed between the NRM's or the NRA's historical promises of good governance, popular democracy, and the protection of the rule of law, and the lived experience of the NRM regime's escalating authoritarian and personalistic tendencies, excuse me, over the last nearly 4 decades under Museveni. Within this broader historical context, was there anything about the 2021 election in Uganda that appeared to be new or unprecedented to you? Or does the violent repression meted out against the opposition, for example, simply seem to be an extension of or an intensification of deeper historical continuities, some of which your article documents very vividly?
Yeah, good question. I think first of all, I am shocked at what I've seen. There was so much gratuitous violence meted out by the police and the army during the aftermath that it makes you wonder, why in the world is the government doing this? Does the government, Museveni in particular, think he is so unpopular now that he has to make this show of force? And we'll find out. But I think when historians look at this period from greater distance than you or I have at the moment, what they're going to say is there's a growth of violence and a growth of intimidation that began really effectively in 2001. Because in 1996, the first election that Museveni appeared in, he really knew from the start that he was going to win. He was so popular. And therefore, he could afford to let democracy play out. I did say that he took a lot of money from the state to run his campaign. Money not available, was not a level playing field, not available to his opponent. But there wasn't much violence or intimidation then. But there was significant violence and intimidation in the next presidential election, 2001, because he had a credible opponent. His name is Besigye, and he came out of the same movement, and thus he was cracking the supposed solidity of the movement behind Museveni. And so the government got scared and began to use more violence. And if you look at the arc, even though there's some dips, the 2006 election was more violent than 2001. 2011 election was less violent, but much more money spent. Both money and, I say some of this in the paper, both money and violence were tools of the government, rarely used by the opposition. And partly, we can excuse the opposition, expect them to have noble intentions, but what we know is they didn't do it, whether they had noble intentions or not. They didn't have access to either. And the 2021 election was, in terms of violence, was a extremely step beyond. Now, probably, I would think, Museveni's popularity has fallen, and he knows it's fallen. And one of the points I did not make in the talk for lack of time, but we should introduce now for the discussion, is the fact that Uganda has struck oil. It hasn't sold a drop of oil yet, but we know it's not going to be the largest oil producer in Africa, but it is going to be a middle-level oil producer. And that means Uganda its GDP is going to be 10 times or many times what it is today. And Museveni, I think, wants to stick around for that, both for the opportunity to remold Uganda, maybe in some good ways, but also to remold the finances of his family as well. That's my suspicion. So he sees his popularity is falling. He sees there's great wealth around the corner. He's going to make sure that nobody is going to take it away from him. Am I speculating? Of course. I don't have access to what's going on in his head, but his actions, I think, speak louder than his mental, than what we would find by going inside his mind. We wouldn't find anything different.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kasfir. I have a question now before I ask my final question. I have one from one of my students, which I think is interesting. Valeria asks, what were the lasting effects of the guerrilla war on the social fabric of different ethnic groups in Uganda? Was there a differentiated experience depending on the group that made it more or less intense?
Lasting effects. Well, that's an interesting question, and it would have to be answered for different groups. Different groups would have had a different impact. There is no question that there's a great deal of animosity toward Museveni's ethnic group. There are problems in deciding which is his ethnic group, but let's just say he comes from an area called Ankoli, and we can just say the Banyankoli are his ethnic group. That's an overstatement, and I'd be glad to qualify it if somebody wants to ask me more about that. But we know that there's there's a great deal of feeling that the Banyankoli in general and Museveni in particular are profiting from their position, and getting them out of power is important. There are many statements that have been made, which are factually accurate, that the Banyankoli hold high positions in greater numbers than other ethnic groups. And there have been particular cases, I'm thinking now of the riots in 2009, in which Banyankoli were attacked during that riot that gave rise to this. The Baganda, the largest group, was a great supporter of Museveni at first, but now many Baganda are feeling that Museveni is not going to support them. And they are attempting, in the same way they have tried since the colonial period, to establish themselves as a dominant ethnic group in Uganda. And they're at loggerheads with Museveni over this issue. There are many details, and I won't go into that. There are many northern groups which now support Museveni for president, but are not very enamored of him. And if they had a credible alternative that they thought would win, they would desert him. So the answer is different for different ethnic groups. But the other point, and this is a point preliminary to Ilaria, if that's your student's name. Sorry, you're muted. But anyway, your student's idea is what's important about it is that Museveni came to power with an anti-sectarian program, which meant, he said, Ugandans have to give up this notion of ethnic dominance one over another, and he's turned that around. He has made ethnicity in many different ways a salient political issue in Ugandan politics today. And he came to power. This is one of the ways in which he's lost his legacy.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kasfir. So if there are no other questions from the audience, I have one more. Now, obviously, I teach at a university in Colombia, a country which has its own long history and experience of guerrilla warfare and rebel governance. I know that you have some knowledge of the Colombian case study. So I wonder, what do you think are the most important insights of this paper that you've just presented for those of us with a comparative interest in rebel governance, which perhaps extends beyond just the Ugandan case study?
Well, there are two kinds of questions. I mean, the lecture is about legacy, not about rebel governance, though rebel governance is how you find out what the legacy is. So let's divide it into two parts. In terms of legacy, as you know, and as I said in the talk, neither the FARC nor the ELN or any other rebel group has taken power in Colombia. So we don't have a legacy issue to study because Colombia, it hasn't happened yet. On the other hand, the comparison of rebel groups, but before I go to the second part, let's just take a look at Mozambique for a moment. Mozambique had a liberation group, Frelimo, which was Marxist and far more Marxist than the NRM ever was, even though Museveni trained with Frelimo and got his first introduction to guerrilla warfare from Frelimo. And he took a number of ideas from Frelimo, but he applied them differently. Frelimo, when it won because the Portuguese dictatorship collapsed and the new government gave independence to Mozambique, and Frelimo was by far the dominant rebel group at the time and the only one that held territory. And as rebels winning the government, Frelimo imposed its program on the villages. It tried to create the new, what they called the new man, and maybe we should be gender free about that and say new man and new woman. They didn't, in the village. And the way in which they did it, they couldn't actually carry it out, and many villagers hated them. And when Renamo, a second group, which was sponsored originally by Rhodesia, which became later Zimbabwe, and later by South Africa, came to the fore, they found it easy to persuade villagers to follow them because they didn't like the legacy that Frelimo had taken from its rebel days and actually imposed. But we can say in terms of legacy studies that Frelimo exercises legacy. Now, turning to the second part of the question, how can we look at the difference in comparative rebel governance across groups? There are enormous differences. It's a terrific area, a very rich area to study. And it will ultimately add a whole dimension to comparative politics, because these kinds of governments have rarely been studied until the last 5-10 years. One of the, see, where was I going to go with this? An important difference between these groups is when you see one group that does an enormous number of things, that has a government which is very large, does is very vigorous, does a lot of activities, and another group which does very little. And you ask, why are these two so different? And this is actually the subject of a long paper that I'm in the middle actually of writing. In Uganda, there was such a case where a rebel group in a very poor part of Uganda on the western border established a much more elaborate government than the NRA did NRM did in the middle of Uganda. But the NRM was more educated, had somewhat more wealth available to it, especially at the beginning. Why is it that they did little government, whereas the other one did a lot of government? And the answer that I'm pursuing is that the Rwenzururu, the one on the border of Uganda and Zaire, or Democratic Republic of Congo, was interested in seceding, whereas the NRM was interested in taking over the government in Kampala. So the NRM said, well, we've got a government that we're going to take over. And I actually asked people in the NRM why they didn't create much of their own government. And this is the answer I got. We are going to take over a government. It's just being run very badly, and we will run it much better. And we will change it in ways that we've learned to do through our rebel governance in the field. The other government, the Rwenzururu, said, we can't do anything in Uganda because we're so small and poor and marginalized. The only thing we can do is secede. So we'll have a secession. And in order to persuade people that they were serious about secession, they said, we're going to be a separate state. We have to have a government. So they created a new government, which any secessionist would have to do. So I'm exploring that argument, which is one example of many about how comparative politics can explore rebel governance.
It reminds me, Dr. Kasfir, of the Clapham's typology of insurgencies and the distinctions between reform insurgencies and secessionist insurgencies. So that's it for my questions. I think Ricardo has a couple of questions to conclude the talk, but I wanted to thank you again for a fascinating lecture, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us.
No, thank you for giving me the platform. I'll listen to. I'm curious what Ricardo would like to ask.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Kasfir. I will have some questions here, and I will start with the first one. Following the judgment handed down by the International Criminal Court against Dominic Ongwen, former commander of the rebel group Lord Resistance Army, for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in northern Uganda, is there any kind of compensation to the victims who have participated in the cause?
I don't think the ICC has given any compensation. I don't know that I don't think they have. Uganda. Well, first of all, let's just notice that Museveni put the case to the ICC, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But Uganda has an amnesty commission, which was very active and fairly successful. And actually, there was some compensation given. People who surrendered as rebels could get amnesty. Ongwen was captured. He didn't have that opportunity. And I'm not sure whether the statute would apply to him anyway, but that would be something I'd have to look up. I don't know the answer for sure on that. But many rebels were given amnesty and given a new start. And donors actually contributed to that. It was a fairly effective program. I think we're talking in the thousands who passed through the amnesty process. And there was small amounts of money given for that purpose, but it was internal to Uganda. Now, as I said, Museveni asked the ICC to take the case against high officials, including Joseph Kone, the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army. Ongwen was captured. It's a difficult case in that he did many terrible things, but on the other hand, he was captured as a child and forced into doing some of these things. But he, as an adult, he was considered responsible and convicted by the ICC. Will serve a sentence now. Other politicians, particularly from one of the old line parties, has said, wait a minute, Museveni has committed war crimes. And there's a fairly strong case that Museveni, in fighting the war in the north, attacked, or his soldiers attacked civilians who weren't really weren't of military value whatsoever, and that he should be brought before the ICC. And Museveni has managed to evade that, but the issue has come up for him too.
Right. I have a second question here. I know you were talking about it just minutes ago, but I would like to say it, and maybe you can go deeper, or we can follow to another. What were the different challenges from the National Resistance Army and the when Sudan Kingdom government confront? Can you compare the governmental structure each of them developed?
I'm not quite sure I'm following the question. You're asking the question about the two groups that I compared, the Rwenzururu and the National Resistance Movement.
Yeah, in fact, the question maybe points about if it's possible to compare the governmental structure of each of them.
Yeah. Well, okay. The answer is, I think, yes, you can compare them. No one has done it very has looked at it as a problem in comparative politics. I wouldn't say no one. That's an exaggeration, but not very many people have taken up this kind of issue. We compare dictatorships to democracies in a whole variety of ways, and that's a standard topic in comparative politics. We compare different kinds of dictators and different kinds of democracies. There's a big field about comparing, for example, presidential systems and multi-party systems. It's a staple of comparative politics. So I would say, and these countries, these governments are very different from each other. So now my proposal is, let's extend the field and admit as an additional corpus of study the different kinds of rebel governments which are formed under very different circumstances because, and this is the crucial thing, they have no sovereignty. You can't have sovereignty until you're recognized within the family of nations. So and they always fight under conditions of war, but then again, some ordinary countries which are recognized as sovereign also fight under war. But I think you can compare what people create as rebel governance, and it's different in a very important way, which strengthens the reason for studying them. They are creative in a way that no established government is creative. Established governments go way back, they change over time, but when you take office in an established government, you take on the routines that have already been adopted. If you're fighting as a rebel, you have to decide whether you take over a government or not. We can notice that Biafra in the Nigerian Civil War took over the government of the Eastern region. So there's an example where they just took over a government. In many other cases, and my Rwenzururu case is a particularly good example, they created it out of whole cloth. They decided what they were going to do. Now, if you ask me, what did they do? They copied the Ugandan government structures to a large extent. That was what they knew. But the choice was theirs. When let me give you a second example from the NRM, which I promised during the lecture, and I'm going to assume that you asked me this question, so I'm going to take advantage of you and answer it this way. The NRM developed these resistance councils and had people elected in the villages. A supremely creative idea. They deserve a lot of credit in their rebel governance for doing this. And when they did it, by the way, the officers who explained to the villagers what they would do stepped aside and let the villagers elect anybody they wanted. Now you say, how could that possibly happen during a civil war? But the answer is, it could happen because there wasn't a huge amount of power outside the village that the villagers were given access to. And if they had done something which would be opposed by to fighting the war, the NRM would have stopped it. But they didn't, and they kept a hands-off policy on those elections. Now, these committees, the NRM started these committees much earlier, but they were supply committees. The NRM guerrilla would go into a village and find a person who was sympathetic and say, would you start a committee to supply us with food, to supply us with intelligence about enemy movements that you hear about, and most importantly, supply us with recruits. And they established a network of these supply committees. But then the people who formed that committee in the village, the civilians who formed those committees, began to take advantage of their positions. And they would settle grudges with other villagers by saying, well, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to call my friends in the NRM in, and that'll be the end of you. And the NRM discovered they were losing popularity because of the advantage taken. The NRM has decided, and this goes back to Luke's question about pragmatism. They said, you know, we believe in democracy, so this is a good reason for having democratic elections, but also there's a pragmatic reason here. We want to avoid being responsible for choosing the people who people are feeling are taking advantage of them. Let them elect anybody they want, and then they can only complain that they chose the wrong people. And that was part of the reason, an important part of the reason why these elections happened. So again, in comparative politics terms, when we ask, why did democracy come into rebel governance in the NRM's case? Part of it was for this kind of reason, and part of it was because they said, we can score a propaganda coup by having democracy, and we believe in it. And I think during the war, they really did.
Very interesting. The third question is, what were the role of Western donor states and organizations to resolve conflicts in Uganda?
To resolve conflicts in Uganda?
Yeah.
What kind of conflicts are you referring to?
Well,
do you mean economic, or you mean wars, fighting in Uganda?
Well, there's not in the questions, but maybe we could say, okay, what were the role of Western donor states and organizations, maybe to, you know, maybe improve governance in Uganda, maybe we could say.
They've tried all the way through. In some respects, there was an attempt to reduce the size of the army. And to some extent, they gave money to for people to move out of the army and to get a start in civilian life. Donors had all kinds of programs for helping farmers, for helping a whole variety of economic activities, and there was an enormous investment in civil society. They saw that investment as a way that they would build up a core of people who would be watchdogs over the government. Did not work out. The government managed to neutralize. They passed laws that required the NGOs to register with them so that the government could decide whether to give a license to an NGO. Some it did, some it did not. And again, a whole variety of policy. I mean, there's a lot of money that's been invested, some of it directly through the government. The donors, many of them gave budget support, which meant they said, here's a free gift, apply it to your budget, use it properly. But they had no recourse to make sure that it went for the appropriate purpose. Many good things happened, but a lot of things didn't actually change the government. The U.S. was very eager to bring Joseph Cohn and the Lord's Resistance Army out of conflict. There's a military conflict, one of the rural rebellions, Uganda, I mean, America eventually put American soldiers into action chasing Cohn. This is after he actually left Uganda, was based in South Sudan and then in the Central African Republic, to no good effect. He's still there. He's still marauding. Again, money was spent without much effect. I do not think the donors have an especially attractive record in Uganda, though I would say they certainly saved a lot of lives. Museveni did a number of spectacular things. For example, he was right on top of AIDS in the 1990s, and he was a donor darling for doing that. and a lot of money went in, and there was a reduction in the amount of victims of AIDS. And again, to give Museveni credit, when the COVID problem occurred, he had a lockdown, didn't worry so much about the economic effects. So we can say there were some good things Museveni did. I don't want to say everything was evil. It's a complicated set of issues. And again, if you compare Museveni with Obote or with Amin, you'd probably rather live under Museveni in spite of all the things he's doing than under the other two. I would. It's a lesser evil, but still, I wouldn't say it was a good situation, but he has brought a certain amount of stability. Whether he can hang on to that is unclear.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting statement. But I guess it's true. I mean, in politics, I always say it's not suitable to talk about good and bad, despite, unless we were talking, on political philosophy, but when we talk about real politics, is that they always lights and shades, and I guess this is quite interesting. There is another question about, could we say that democratization process in Uganda was more focused on building and reforming institutions than maybe on conflict resolution?
Then maybe on what? On
conflict resolution.
Controversial solutions.
Conflict resolution.
Conflict resolution.
Conflict, excuse me, conflict resolution. Thank you. No, it's fine. It's fine. I have a bad ear. Well, I mean, of course, there's been efforts made on both fronts, both from domestic sources and from foreign donors. The peculiar thing was Uganda really had an excellent constitution in the 1990s. The blip about having extending no party democracy was a defect, but the Constitution had all kinds of safeguards built into it. And one by one, they were removed. So I would say that democratization has gone way downhill in Uganda at the central level and at the local level too, though the serious problem is at the national level. And it's all based on the fact that if Museveni is going to have his fingers in all the pots, he has to take the sting out of institutions, to take the sting out of it. I mean, the ability of institutions to enforce their rules. And he succeeded in doing that. And one of the victims, one of the consequences is that democratization has been put aside. Now, conflict resolution, it's interesting. If you accept that Museveni should be the arbiter in Uganda, he will spend a lot of time resolving issues, and he listens. The key to working through issues with Museveni is you have to accept that he's the arbiter. You can't challenge his authority. Accept his authority, he's willing to listen, and he will often come up with solutions which are somewhat workable. A whole variety of people. He is willing to stay up night after night. I mean, I don't know when the man sleeps, but he will spend a huge amount of time with interested parties, and they know they can talk to him. Again, you can't be an opposition figure. You can't say, I'm going to run against you. But if you are willing to say, you're the boss, then he'll listen, and often he'll work through and come up with a solution which is acceptable. You know, a compromise means nobody gets what they want, but everybody gets something. And he's willing to do that. And one of the ways he's established a stable framework up to this time has been to work through compromises which flow through him. It's a personalist system. He disappears, and then all bets are off. And the best instance we have to turn to is what happened in Chad when Debbie suddenly died, and it ended up being his son, chosen by others because they couldn't agree, and they accepted him, and we'll see how stable that is. Something like that is a plausible outcome were Museveni to suddenly leave the scene for whatever reason. And I would say the stable framework he has established, because people accept his authority, is disappearing. He has less resources to support his authority, and you can only take clientelism so far. And if people stop believing in you, you lose legitimacy, then, which I think has been a steady erosion, and that may account for the extra coercion that we're seeing in the past few years, particularly since the 2021 election.
That's great. I have a last question. Indeed, there is no more, but I did have one, and it's more a theoretical one question, and it has to be with when we stop to talk about the rebel governance. I mean, for instance, we talk about Frelimo, we have the NRA, maybe we can talk about, Rwandan National Front even, but when we have a rebel governance, maybe in trying to take the power, and when there is the power, when we finish to talk about the rebel governments and a legitimate government, I mean, they took the power and they already are ruling the power. One example I can go to my mind could be, Kabila on Kinshasa, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
They were a rebel, they were a government then.
Mm-hmm.
So in this area of rebel studies, there is a clear limit when we talk about the rebel governance of the power and in the power then.
Sorry, Rebel, the last piece of it, say it again, please.
There is a clear conceptual limit to talk about the rebel governance when they are trying to take the power and when they already took it.
Mm-hmm. Well, my interest is really not in legacy, even though that's the paper I gave. My interest is very much like the questions you are asking in what do rebels do when they're fighting a war and they try to figure out governments for civilians. Kabila is an interesting case because I don't, and also Kagame. Take Kabila first. Kabila got to power. He basically was involved in running a gold mine in southeastern Congo, in which he just kind of was left alone. He had a few soldiers. There was some organization there. There wasn't much going on. In terms of the three clusters of civilian administration, civilian participation, and commercial production, he was involved in commercial production only. So there was something. But the way he got to Kinshasa was on the backs of the Rwandan army and the Ugandan army. They carried him. And in fact, he wasn't even their first choice as leader, but the first choice was actually mysteriously killed in a training camp. I can't remember, I've got his name in a file, but I can't remember it right now. But Kabila was picked up second, and it was kind of a stroke of luck for him that he was accepted. So the way in which he came to power was by foreign conquest, not by a rebel taking power. So I consider it a different kind of case to argue. There's even another difference why I would reject the Rwandan case as a case of rebel governance. In Rwanda, the rebellion began. Kagame was not at the beginning of the rebellion. Kagame was in the United States. He was at Fort Leavenworth taking a course, and a higher official in the National Resistance Army, a man named Fred Regima, also Rwandan, and Tutsi, as Kagame is, engineered the rebellion. There's a real question whether Museveni actually knew about it beforehand. My belief is he did not, but came quickly to support it. But what happened after they got there, Regima was killed in the first couple of days, possibly by one of his underlings who wanted to take the position. Kagame came back right away and assumed command as the highest ranking officer after Regima. But if you look at the situation in Rwanda, the civilians fled. People said, this is an army out of Uganda. It's run by Tutsis. We are mostly Hutu. They claim they're going to support us, but we're afraid they might kill us. Everybody fled. In order to have rebel governance, you have to hold territory populated by civilians. Otherwise, it's outside the definition of the term. So I would reject the Rwandan case because there was almost nobody living in the area that was controlled early in the war by the Rwandan Liberation Front. Later, it changed, and as they moved south, but by that time, they were moving as a military force, and there wasn't very much rebel governance either. Still, there are many, many cases, and they're all interesting. You could look at Charles Taylor in Liberia, who actually did run a government, a pretty terrible one, but there was a rebel government there. And you could look at the best of all, the most democratic of rebel groups, and that's the PAIGC, Amilcar Cabral's group in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, in which the amount of democracy and the stability of a civilian administration is quite phenomenal. It's unbelievable, really. They held an election to a legislature just before they won, in which they said only 1/3 of the seats will go to members of our party. 2/3 will go to other people unaffiliated with our party. And so they formed the first legislature that way. The sadness of it was that Cabral turned out to be the central figure in it. He was assassinated, apparently by a member of his own movement. And as you know, the government of Guinea-Bissau didn't follow the legacy very much at all.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kasfir, and also to Luke and the Semillero of Estudios Globales to coordinate these events. We want to extend our gratification from Lía Rodríguez de la Vega, our president in ALADAA International, which she has been really grateful of your dissertation and your expositions. And also to the whole participants who stand here and they did their questions and was following this event. With these words, I conclude this event, and we invite you to carry on our website in Diálogos ALADAA and ALADAA International, and the next events we will carry on by our website. Thank you very much to all.
And thank you. I am very happy to have had the conversation.
Thank you.
Okay.